So my name's Andy. I'm just here to welcome you all to Auto Trader. Thank you very much for coming if you work from outside Auto Trader, and well done for coming up the stairs if you're working here. We're really pleased to host an event for NCC Group. We've been working with them for, I have just found out, for 12 years. We don't refer to anyone as NCC Group, I'm afraid. We still say site confidence. I don't know if anyone else still does that, but we've been using synthetic monitoring to test all our external services, user journeys and page tests for a long time. They are the source of truth in terms of our availability and performance, and we thank them for the constant 3 AM alerts. It's nice to bring together the people who are responsible for the alerts and the people who receive them. Might be some discussions later on that. Well, we've got Andy Davies here today to talk to us. He's got loads and loads of experience in terms of web operations and web performance. So, yeah, really looking forward to that. Afterwards, we've got the opportunity to do a tour of the office here, if that'd be useful. And there's also beer and pizza just over there when we've finished, if you're interested. So if you want to do a tour, just give myself a shout, or Dave White, who sat over in the corner there, and we'll show you around the cars, which is what everyone's interested in. That's it. Thank you very much.
Fabulous, thank you. So, I'm Andy. It's a bit tall up here, so I'll be careful not to fall off. So, in theory, we have 2 hours together of you listening to me. And I have enough slides to do that, but we will have a break in the middle. And if anybody's got any questions partway through, or want to question something I say, stop me, stick your hand up, ask me. Let's try and make this as interactive as possible. So let's start out in the beginning. I've been doing web performance on and off since 1998. Originally trying to deliver e-learning off the web. I then went freelance, and then NCC Group hired me. I've written the book on the left, as you look, is published. The book on the right will be coming when we finished. It's supposed to have a publication date of the 25th of December. We haven't sent the manuscript to the publisher yet, so it'll be out in the new year. But I also spend a lot of time talking about web performance, talking to developers, business people, operations people, about why we should make websites fast, how we make websites fast, and what that means from a user experience point of view. And today I'm going to talk a bit about what it means from a user experience point of view, so why we should do it, what it means commercially to businesses, and I'm also going to dig into the technical side of it. Not so much about how we make websites fast, but the factors we need to consider when we're building sites and how they influence how our sites perform. But I fully acknowledge that performance is a priority for everyone. When we're building websites, we have multiple stakeholders who are all pushing us after their goals. We have marketing people who want new features added to the site, right down to a marketing director who says, make the logo bigger, and it does happen. We have people who want to add A/B testing to see how effective our sites are. We have features people want added. So performance gets pushed to the back of the queue. It tends to be something that gets considered last. And unfortunately, we end up with this. We've all been there looking at websites, having clicked on a link, waiting, watching, wondering whether it's ever going to load. And the reason we do this, and the reason we get fed up like this poor boy here, is not because we're impatient. It's down to the way we're built. It's down to the way we're made. And we perceive response times in a particular way. So back in 1968, Robert Miller of IBM did the first study on how we perceive response times. And what he was doing is looking at how people were touching light pens on screens. And what he discovered that if something happens within 100 milliseconds, we consider it instant. If it happens between 200 and 300 milliseconds, it's good enough that we're aware there's a slight delay, but it doesn't really affect us. Then, as we wait longer, so when we get to 1 second, a 1 second response time to something we do is quick enough that we can carry on seamlessly with our actions and doesn't break our flow. But as we're made to wait longer and longer, it begins to break up our flow. We begin to task switch, our minds begin to turn off. And eventually, when we get to about 10 seconds, our mind has gone elsewhere. And the really frightening thing about this is that a company called Radware, who are based out of Canada, do a State of the Internet, State of the Nation, quarterly. And in their most recent study, and what they do in this study is they study the top 100 North American retail sites. In their most recent study, only 12% actually rendered feature content, so hero images, not completely loaded the page, but rendered feature content such as hero images, things that visitors was expecting to be able to interact with. Only 12% of those did it within 3 seconds. And this is quite a frightening statistic because the UK is not far behind this. We do a study of about 50 sites every half year, and we have some very similar numbers to this. But, are we being impatient when we switch off, or is there something else at work? And a company called Phobins, who are a user experience consultancy, actually a couple of years ago spent a long time looking at this. And what they did is they had 15 participants in their study. And they attached sensors to their face, they attached EEG caps to their head so they could measure brain activity, and they focused webcams on them. And then they gave them 2 tasks to complete. One was to buy some travel insurance, and one was to buy a laptop from a retail site. And randomly, they picked people amongst the cohort and slowed down their web experience. They slowed down their network connection from 5 megs per second to 2 megs per second. And that was enough of a change to actually cause issues for those participants who were slowed down. The people who had the slower experience were aware they were more agitated in debriefs. You could see from the webcam pictures that were taken that their facial muscles were moving more. The sensors picked up their facial muscles were moving more. And when they looked at the brain activity, I think it's alpha waves in the brain, were actually 50% higher, so they were actually having to work harder to remain focused on the task in hand. And what this means is that the longer we make people wait, and this is page load time in this situation, is the more likelihood they will click away. This was a study done in the Netherlands, 200 sites, 177 million page views over a 2-week period. And looking at the green line to begin with and ignoring the yellow line, you can see that that bounce rate, or the abandonment rate, climbs really rapidly. At 3 seconds, we're already at 17% abandonment rate. The iPhone is slightly different due to the way an iPhone or mobile phones connect to the cellular networks. There's a bit of a delay, so that's why there's that sort of flat bit between 1 and 2 seconds. But then equally, that fairly quickly gets to the same level of abandonment. We don't accept that on a mobile device that's connected to a cellular network, we expect the same experience as on a fixed line. We don't accept it's a worse experience. And not only do people just abandon, but it also has a negative impact on brand. So Radware again did a study last year where they compared John Lewis, Tesco's Direct, EasyJet and Ryanair. They again wired people up with EEG caps to measure brain activity. And what they did is they just made them browse these sites and do tasks on these sites using a mobile phone connected to Wi-Fi. And the difference between the 2 sets of tests was they added a half-second delay at the start of the page, at the start of the test. And if we look at the left where Tesco's is fast, there are some easy to use, mobile friendly, fast. Some people say slow, some people still say confusing. But then if we look at the bottom right, on the slower experiences, there are a lot more emotive words. So the slowness conjures up emotion in people. So it's boring, it's clunky, it's tacky, it's inelegant, it's childlike. So, being slow triggers physiological and emotional reactions in us, and it makes people abandon our sites. But we're funny old people, and we are more tolerant when we start to go down purchase flows. So when we look at product pages, we expect it to be fast. But once we start to make a commitment to decide we're going to buy something or go down the process, we will wait. We will accept our pages being slower. And Sosta, who produce a real user measurement product, actually they've got some really interesting statistics around this to show how our behaviour will vary as visitors. And the other reason we're weird is we're suspicious if something's too fast. And this may apply to those of you who work for Autotrader. And so Kayak are a hotels and flight booking company. And they had some studies where they were returning results really, really quickly. And their fall-off rate was really, really high. And what they discovered was that they were too fast, and people didn't believe they were doing a proper job of searching all the airlines and searching all the hotels. So they actually went for the active approach of putting this little widget up that what happens is when you search, the progress bar goes up and the airline thing flicks over to show people they were actually doing something. They can return results faster than they actually are, but they're actively making people, or displaying to people, making people think they're working and they're working hard, to gain that trust back. But those are the oddball cases. Those are the cases that are, we're in a purchase funnel. People commit. People searching for flights, what a different experience. But to get them there, they have to learn our product pages first. They have to find what they're looking for. And performance really matters to us. The Guardian did a study on, they have a reader panel of 3,000 people. They asked them about 17 product drivers. And their number one product driver amongst the consumers of The Guardian was well organised, easy to find content. The second driver was it had to be fast. Walmart quite handily gave us some numbers. You'll notice that they've got no y-axis. So they haven't quite given us clearly the numbers, but we can sort of work them out. And what we can see is that as the page load time goes up along the bottom, their conversion rate falls off really, really sharply. And my guess, so amongst retail sites in the UK, the average conversion rate is about 2.7%. And retailers who can push it above that will make a lot more money. It's very profitable like that. So my guess is that the dot in the 1 to 2 second line is somewhere around the 2.7% conversion. So, as the page load time goes up, conversions fall quite rapidly. A more modern case is Staples. What Staples did is improve conversions by 10%. And at the median, they improved page load time by a second. So that's if we had 100 visits and measured all their time, and the one in the middle, they made that second quicker. But what we get when we measure people's experiences on websites and how quickly they load is we get a long tail. We get a tail that goes on forever, as we'll come on to. And at the top end of that tail, they made their people's experience 6 seconds better. And that had a huge impact on conversions. Bing carried out some experiments. Yeah? They added a second to search times and saw their revenue per visitor go down by 2.8%. Shopzilla, which is the classic case study that always gets quoted, it's a bit old these days. They went from around between 7 and 9 seconds, and they took 5 seconds off that, and conversions went up 28%. They got twice as many page views, and in North America they cut their server estate from 200 servers to 100 servers. So not only did they get a boost in revenue, they actually cut their operational and capex costs. And then finally, Seawave, who based in London, secondary ticket marketplace, a bit cagey with their numbers because they'll only talk about above and below 4 seconds. But the difference is they put a lot of effort into performance and they get twice as many page views when the pages load in less than 4 seconds as above. Their bounce rate is 6 times better and their conversion is about 28%. So we have, as an industry, pretty overwhelming evidence that performance is good for our businesses. But I get frustrated because I spend a lot of time talking about performance, and if anybody ever looks at the HTTP archive, for example, what we see is that our pages over time are getting larger and larger. And our sites are getting slower and slower. And it sometimes leads me to the point that, is the web too slow? Will the web ever compete with native apps, for example? If we don't put the same effort into building our websites as people put into building native apps, will the web die? The web has a huge number of unique characteristics that we can't bring to apps. In fact, we can send a link to something to anybody, and we can load it on laptops, phones, Wii's, Nintendo DS's. So the web has a huge amount going for it, but will we turn off if it's too slow? Will we just get fed up and go to an app world where we have 36 apps that need updating on our app? And then I think, as I browse around the web, and I sort of remember that not all sites are slow. There are plenty of sites that are fast, but there are too many sites that are too slow. And to come back to the Radware numbers, we talked about the 12% of US sites that take 3 seconds to load meaningful content. And year on year, they got slower by 23%. And it comes down to something my friend Tim Cadillac says, is we're not being deliberate about performance. We're not taking performance seriously. So, for example, YouTube, about a year ago, spent a huge amount of time making it faster, looking at how fat their site was and making it faster. And then they had some puzzling results in that they also had this bulk of people who were having an even slower experience. And they couldn't work it out until they actually looked at these people who were having a slower experience. And all of a sudden, they had people from Siberia and Mongolia and further reaches of the world that weren't able to access their site before and use it for. They didn't have a usable experience. And all of a sudden, by making it lighter and faster, is these people start using their site. And this is probably the most overused slide that anybody's ever done in a web presentation. But, Tim Berners-Lee said the web is for everybody. But I would contend it's only for everybody if we build it that way. And to build it that way, we need to understand our fundamental building blocks of the web. And, when we think about design, we tend to think about colour, layouts, hierarchy, depth. We tend to think about the visual design of sites and less about how networks behave and how browsers behave on the underpinnings of how our experience gets to our visitors. And why is that a problem? Because everybody has fast broadband now, except for me. I live in the sticks. I get a 4 meg internet connection. You know, it's quite interesting to look at and get a real world experience of what some people have. But broadband speeds are rising, supposedly. And these are Ofcom's numbers. So this is up to November 13. I always regard these with caution, because when you look at the numbers Akamai publish, for example, as to what the average broadband speed they see in the UK is, they see somewhere around 11 megs, and Ofcom have, for want of a better phrase, a political agenda. You know, they want to prove they're making the web faster for everybody. Well, everybody's getting faster internet connections. So I trust Akamai's numbers at 11 megs. But regardless of how fast our people's internet connections are, is the real user experience varies. You know, we connect using different devices. We connect, you know, with different connections. It's not untypical in a family household. In my household, for example, my daughter comes home from university. There's me doing something on a Mac. There's my son watching Minecraft videos on YouTube. My daughter watching Doctor Who episodes, and my wife shopping for something. You know, they're all going down this fast internet connection. So, you know, this is a real-world example of a site where the load time varies. And what's even worse is it has such a long tail that if we only looked at those, measured the first 10-second buckets, we'd missed the 24% of people who had a slower experience than that. And this isn't a commercial website, but if it was, it'd be interesting to see how much money is in that 24% at the end, if we could bring them this way and make them fun. But the other thing we've got to think about is that, you know, we've got plenty of bandwidth. And so, are all these people who have a slow experience? Do they have low bandwidth? Or do they have slow devices? And this is the BBC, tested using web page test. The connection has been artificially restricted to 1.5 megabits per second. There's some spikes over the top due to the way the testing works. But you know, as we can see, we don't saturate the connection. There's still plenty of bandwidth available on our connection. And I thought it'd be interesting to ask a question. So, on this slide, we have 2 videos, both from Sainsbury's, supermarket website loading, and one's loaded at 1 megabits per second, and the other's loaded at 10. And so my question to you is, who thinks 10 megabit per second video will load before 1 megabit? Anybody? A couple brave souls. Who thinks 1 megabit per second video will load before 10 megabit? Who doesn't trust me and thinks it's a trick question? Okay, well, should we find out? So, those who put your hands up saying you shouldn't trust me were probably right. Because somehow we've got to this situation where a 1 megabit per second, or the site loadable 1 meg per second, is loaded faster than over 10 megs per second. And the reason was, as I only told you part of the story. And the bit I missed is I didn't talk about latency. And 28 milliseconds round trip time is about average of broadband in the UK. The 280 milliseconds is about average over 3G. So latency has a huge impact on our page load times and how our websites behave. And we often think of the network as a pipe. We talk about it as a pipe. We talk about having a fatter pipe when we have a faster connection. And we think about it as a pipe that's sometimes really, really bad. You know, when we've got no bandwidth, no connection, think of a pipe with some water dripping out of it. But the reality of how the networks work is much more akin to a bucket brigade. So where we request something from a web server and we send it some packets, and then we get packets back. We get a bucket of data back that has to be passed along the line until it reaches us. And that brings about delays, you know, as it gets transferred between each hop, or how far our destination or origin is away from us. And Mike Belshie of Google, who was one of the guys who invented speeding, did a paper back in 2008, I think it was, and I've repeated this study since, that, you know, looking at how bandwidth affects page load time. And what we see is that between 1 and 2 seconds, doubling the bandwidth, between 1 and 2 megabits per second, doubling the bandwidth improves the load time and the time the page starts to render by about 40%. And then when we get down to 5 megs and go to 10 megs, we actually, even though we double the bandwidth again from 5 to 10 meg, it makes about 4% difference. So we're in the land of decreasing returns as we get faster and faster network speeds. And whereas when we look at latency in comparison, what we see is that round trip time, so the latency, has a linear relationship, so it directly affects how quickly those pages load. So that the more latency we have, the longer pages start to load, and the bigger impact it will have on our business experience. And latency increases with distance. This is why we all pay people like Akamai and other CDNs lots of money. So, yeah, these are times from London, so 28 milliseconds to continental Europe, 81 milliseconds to Chicago, 266 milliseconds to Auckland. And that's a third of a second. And that's what happens is I make a request, and the first response I get back will take roughly a third of a second for servers in New Zealand. And we don't just have the backbone latency, we have the devices we have, the last mile latency, so the devices we have on it. We have routers and congested peering points, we have mobile towers, we have things like my dad's ADSL line that had a broken wire between the back of the router and the port in the wall that corrected its net performance. So latency, apart from being limited by the speed of light, is also affected quite a lot by the devices we put in between. And this is a problem because, you know, to get something from a web server, we have to make multiple round trips. TCP has something called congestion meter. So when I make a request to a web server, it will only send me a number of packets in response. Most modern web servers, most modern Linux kernels will send 10 packets, so that's roughly around 15K. If you've got a Windows 2012 server, it only sends 4K. So 4 packets, so that's just under 5K. So what happens then is, it's the way TCP learns how much data it can reliably send back and forth between those 2 points. So what happens is the first, in this case, this is congestion mode 3. So what happens is I make a request to the web server, I'll get the first three packets of the response. If I, as a browser, acknowledge successfully all those 3 packets, next time the web server will send me 6. If I acknowledge all 6, next time it will send me 10. And what it's doing is trying to grow that window so it can have as many packets in flight as possible. And if some get lost or I don't acknowledge them, it'll shrink it back. So it's constantly growing and shrinking this window to try and understand what it can send down the wire. And latency is our greatest enemy as web developers. It's the one thing that we spend a lot of time working around. Sometimes we cheat it using user experience methods. So This is actually Instagram's app, and what they do to cheat is somebody clicks the like button, and the heart goes red, and the number of likes go up. But what's actually happened is the user's got some feedback as soon as they've clicked that like button. If we look, the network request is still going on in the background, so they've given the impression that the action's taken place, and they will handle actually recording the action in the background and catching it if it fails. And we have plenty of recipes to work around latency. We've got Scott Gell's responsive web design book that's just come out, which is quite interesting. There's Lara Hogan's book, Steve Sanders' book, my book. There are lots of recipes out there to deal with latency, to make websites faster. But some of them are hacks. And we have to sort of keep this in mind when we follow these recipes. So we have browsers that now support more than one connection in parallel. Originally we started off with 2, today we have 4 or 6 or 8 or 11, I think there's 12 in certain circumstances. And this is a hack around some of the limitations of TCP. We split resources across multiple domains. The danger with this is we actually may get increased packet loss. We use data URIs to inline stuff, particularly in CSS to inline images. But this leads to larger download sizes. It also overrides browser priorities. Browsers don't download stuff in the order they see it on the page. They go find the stuff that's on the page and make decisions about what's the order they think they should download things. We merge CSS into bundles, we merge JavaScript into bundles to reduce the number of requests. And that gives us the challenge that there's actually more to download, because often, we have 3 CSS files, they may change at different rates. If we've got JavaScript, so jQuery may change infrequently, whereas our own size JavaScript may change more frequently. And we merge them together, and we end up in a situation where anytime something changes, we have to download it all again. So a single file, a single change, invalidates the whole bundle. With sprites, instead of downloading lots and lots of little images, we put them together and use CSS to separate them. But the challenge is, to get just one image, you have to download the whole lot, decode the whole image, which may have problems on mobile phones, because mobile phones have very little memory, and pull that image out. And the reality is, there's a tension between how we build sites and how we develop sites, how we, from a software development point of view, break things down into components, and then the most efficient way to bundle them together to get a fast online experience. And there are tools out there to fill this gap. There are things like mod page speed or Akamai's Ion service is now the Radware tool set that was strangely. And we have build processes using Gulp and Grunt to try and get over some of these inefficiencies. But couldn't we be more efficient? Couldn't the protocol itself be more efficient? Couldn't the protocol itself cope with latency better? And this is where HTTP2 comes into the picture. And a bunch of people, Mike Belshi and Roberto Pio at Google, when they were developing Speedy, essentially looked at the latency problems and looked at the issues they were causing, and came up with Speedy, which was then adopted by the IETF as a replacement for HTTP 1.1. And the biggest thing it has different is it only uses a single TCP connection to the site. So this is the same site, loaded via HTTP 1.1 on the bottom, and you can see there's 6 TCP connections. There's a bit of HTML, and the green is CSS, the orange is JavaScript, and there's all images. And then across the top we can see how it loads using HTTP2, and it loads in roughly the same time, even though the top one's done a TLS negotiation as well. I've seen sites where HTTP2 is slower. I've also seen sites where HTTP2 is about 30% faster. But what it's doing is, with HTTP 1.1, we make a request for, say, an image, and then we have to wait for that image to complete on that connection before we can reuse that connection. So, whereas the alternative in HTTP2 is it multiplexes things. So, I make all my requests for what I know. So I request the web page, I get the response back. As soon as I start parsing HTML, I discover images, scripts, etc. And as soon as I discover them, I can request them from the web server. And the web server will deal with sending me the chunk. And it may not send me a whole image. It may send me part of an image. And this offers us some interesting opportunities, and particularly around images. So John Mellor at Google did an experiment, and what he did is he looked at how much of an image we need to make a website usable. And he picked BBC News, and all these images, they've just sent the first 5% of the bytes to the image. And then he did it with 15, and we can see that it starts to fill out. Some of the hero images are a bit more usable. Then we get to here, and finally, 80%. We've got a virtually completely usable page. And what we can do with HTTP2 is, so we can decide to send the HTML, send the CSS, and then send just a chunk of all the images that need to start drawing the page, and then wait until we've got the rest of the JavaScript down, or the rest of some other resources we might care about, and fill in the rest of the images afterwards. There are concerns, so there are some question marks over whether people like progressive images. That will be resolved. The study that it was done for was quite small, so that's things looking at. But the main difference is we see the way priorities work differently in a browser. So we get this jaggedy line under HTTP1 and under HTTP2. We can see where the requests have gone, and we're waiting for the results. The other big thing HTTP2 does is add compression. So when we make a web request, we send lots and lots of headers of it. We send cookies, we send accept encodings, we send our user agents. And they're sent for every request on the page, but they're very, very similar between requests. There's a lot of wasted bandwidth there. So the other thing HTTP2 is add some compression in to get rid of that, to deduplicate it, to make it smaller. The final thing on HTTP2 is Google and Mozilla and now IE have said they will only support it. I said HTTPS here, but it's actually TLS because SSL is essentially dead. And the reason for this is not just for a privacy reason, because they'd like the whole web to be secure. It's if we're going to implement new protocols on the web, we have to get them through proxy servers, whether they're in corporate gateways or whether they're in ISPs or mobile carriers. And the only reliable way to get traffic through them is to encode it so they can't play with it. HTTP2 will start to roll out next year. Akamai have semi-publicly stated that it will turn it on a opt-out basis for all their customers by the first half, by the end of the first half of next year, which is going to make quite an interesting playground to experiment in, because we're only just starting HTTP. We don't know fully what options it will give us to optimize or what challenges it will bring us. So the fact it compresses headers between requests means the server has to track more stuff as the whole connection is open for long. And what does that mean in load terms? What does it mean in terms of our server infrastructure? There's something called server push coming that allows us to say, okay, you requested this HTML page. I know this CSS file belongs to this HTML page. I'm going to send it to you before you ask for it, and I'll come on to that in a bit. So Google and Twitter and Facebook are all rolling it out now. Akamai will be the first major rollout that will go across a lot of sites, and people will start using it transparently because IE, Chrome, Firefox, maybe even Safari will support it out of the box. But it's going to be a voyage of discovery. And I'm going to stop the first half there. We will come on to this in a bit, once everybody's had some refreshments. But to begin with, first up, are there any questions?
Silence.
Cool. All right, go get a coffee. So, in part one, we talked quite a lot about the network. We talked about, wide performance maps from a business point of view. We dug into latency, and that's the impact of latency. If you remember nothing from today, apart from two things, one of which we'll come on to. Remember the impact that latency has on our user experience. It's the biggest thing that has an impact on it. And any way we can work around, or any sane way we can work around that latency barrier, will improve our visitors' experience. The other thing I'm going to talk about, and we need to consider when we're building pages, is how do we go from the experience on the left to the experience on the right? What does the browser do to render our page? What does it need to know? What's the critical path? Because that's the other thing that can make a huge difference to our users' experience. And this is actually NBC News. This was actually taken on my Nexus 4. So this is real, and these screenshots are real. But what happens at the beginning is we start off with a web page. Browser does a GET request, gets the web page from the server, gets some HTML back, and in this case, a really trivial example. And what it then does with that text is it converts it into a document object model, or the DOM. And it can do this progressively. So as it starts to receive TCP packets containing the HTML back, it can start to build the DOM, working from the top down. Then at some point, on a pretty normal web page, it will discover a CSS file. So in this one, we've got imaginatively named styles.css. So we built the DOM, and then we discover we need CSS. So we request the CSS down, and it starts to build the CSS object model. And building the CSS object model is slightly different to building the HTML DOM, because we can build the DOM progressively as we get bits of HTML down, bits of the file down. But because of the way CSS cascades, because of the way we can override or add to styles that we've seen earlier on, we have to get all the CSS before we can completely build the CSS object model. So what we can see here is we've got a body. You can see the cascades. We've got a body that's got a font size of 16 pixels, and then the H1 tag inherits a font size of 16 pixels and adds its own text decoration. And that's one of the great powerful things of CSS, is the way it's layered on top of each other. It's layered, so we can add to it and we can augment it. But that means we have to have all the CSS files before we can finally build it. And that means if they're in separate CSS files, we have to go get them all. Then what happens is it combines the DOM and CSS into a render tree. And this is the point where it discovers, okay, I have these elements, they use these styles. Combine them together so I can begin to understand how things are visually laid out on the page, what the colours are, what the typography is. And then from this, we then render a page. Build a render tree, the browser calculates the layout, and then paints the page. But we have perhaps the root of all evil, in that JavaScript brings about special properties, in that JavaScript blocks DOM construction. So when a browser comes across a script tag, it has to pause. It can't carry on constructing the DOM because the JavaScript may alter the DOM. So it waits until it's got that JavaScript, until it's executed that JavaScript, and then it will continue to build the DOM afterwards. The other thing is, because JavaScript can also alter our CSS, the browser won't start executing any JavaScript that appears after our CSS follows until the CSS object model is built. So this brings about a bunch of dependencies. And to look at those dependencies, I thought we should pretend we're a browser. And in this case, we'll pretend to be Firefox. And the two key rules we have to remember are constructing the CSS object model blocks JavaScript execution, and JavaScript blocks DOM construction. So we'll go get our example HTML file, and we issue our GET request, and then we wait. We wait until the request goes to the server builds the response, and sends it back. And then we have our HTML file. And then what the browser starts to do is parse this HTML to build the DOM. And it comes across some CSS. So what it does is it sends off the request for the CSS. But it can carry on building the DOM while it's waiting for that CSS. And then we come across our second one. And again, we can send that request off. We carry on building the DOM. And then we come to a script. And remember, scripts block DOM construction. So we send the GET request off for the script, and then we have to wait. The browser must now wait. And it's waiting for two things at this point. It's waiting for the CSS to download and the object model to be built. And it's waiting for the JavaScript file to be downloaded and then executed. And then once that JavaScript file has been downloaded and executed, the DOM construction can carry on, and it will find the second one. And again, here we send off request for the script, and again we wait. And once we've got the JavaScript downloaded and executed, we can carry on building the rest of the DOM. And we eventually get to an image. We can send off the image request, don't need to wait, carry on, go get the next image, and send off the request from that. And that's the way browsers build. That's the way the main browser thread builds our web pages. Now, came around in IE 7 or 8, browsers invented something called the preload. And what the preloader does is hide some of that penalty we have while we're waiting for JavaScript. So if we go back here, go to this one. So what preloader does is when the main DOM parser finds the script, the preloader essentially starts off a lightweight search, looking through the rest of the HTML file, looking for other scripts it could download, other images it could download, and downloads them and puts them in the browser's cache. So that once we've executed this script here, this one is hopefully already loaded and already waiting in the browser cache just to be executed. But originally browsers used to go through this horrible delay that dramatically affected our user's experience, and browsers built preloader to overcome them. But what that means, and so Mozilla reckon the preloader delivers a 19% speed up in both render time and page load time. Chrome across 2,000 sites made it 20%. So it delivers a huge benefit to our visitor experience. The key thing we need to remember is we need to structure pages with that in mind. So structure pages in mind that the CSS is the most critical thing to be downloading. And that in the head we only have the minimum amount of JavaScript we need to render the page. And what this means, so what we do here is we minimize the amount of blocking that's going on. And then we should load the rest of the JavaScript at the bottom of the page. And there's often a question when we take different JavaScript files and merge them together is, should I merge them all together? How big should I make them? And the rule of thumb I use is I split them into sort of 30k chunks if I can. It's not feasible for everything, but the idea is we've got browsers that open multiple connections, so by splitting them into chunks, we can download them in parallel. The other thing we can use is something called the async attribute. And what the async attribute does is it tells the browser that it doesn't need to wait for this script. To tell the browser it can go on and build the DOM because this script won't alter the DOM. Async is essentially making a promise to the browser that I won't alter the HTML on this page. And one of the things we see quite a lot with some websites is a lot of people put lots and lots of JavaScript files in the head of their pages, and it makes a huge difference to how quickly that page starts to display to their visitors. But to go back to the render tree. The render tree is where the browser begins to understand what styles are used and matches the styles up to the HTML. And this brings about some interesting dependencies, because generally we use our CSS to declare where our fonts are and what background images we've got. And the browser only begins to understand we're using that font or we're using that background image at the point they build the render tree. So we get this situation where the page is laid out, it actually knows what text is on that page, but because at the point it's built the render tree, it's only discovered it needs a font then. The browser will sit and wait for the font to be downloaded before it finishes rendering the page. And this, so Chrome and Firefox, Opera will wait 3 seconds before they time out of font. Safari will wait forever. And IE doesn't wait at all. What IE will do is use its default font and then flash the web font over the top. But this leads us to some problems because the font is discovered really late. We know what we're going to do to render the page, and we then have to wait for the font to become available to display it something. So my sort of recommendation here is, if you do use web fonts, is use fonts that prioritize this experience. There are some font foundries that do things like their font files are only cached for 10 minutes because they're more interested in their license model than your visitor's experience. So pick font foundries that make the lowest number of requests, that deliver the fonts quickly to the browser, so that the visitors aren't waiting and experiencing this, the blank screen, no text, instead of looking at your site. But there are some other ways around this problem. And at the moment, we have a pull model. Browsers work on a pull model. We make a request, the browser sends us the HTML response. The server sends us the HTML response. the browser then starts to parse the HTML, discover what other resources it needs, and then it requests them. But our servers know what page has been sent. They quite often know what other resources go with it. So they know that when they send this HTML file, the next thing the visitor often requests is the CSS to go with it. So what if we could push the resources we know our visitors will need before their browsers discover they need them? And let's go back to understand why this might be handy. We need to look at what happens at the network level when we make a request for a web page. So in this case, we make a request for index.html, and the server builds the page, sends the response, the browser finds out what else it needs, and makes requests for those. But while the server's building that web page, our network is idle. Our congestion window is not growing from a TCP level, and that's, it's great to get it loading quickly. So what happens if we could short circuit that and actually push the resources that are critical to our page out before the browser discovers it needs them? Yeah, and then once it's got, once we've pushed the CSS down, the web page itself comes down afterwards, and the browser can then discover the resources it needs. It can get the CSS out of cache, so it can start down that process along the critical path of building the page and building the render tree more quickly. And the other thing is the browser can actually reject the push. And this is something that's coming in part of HTTP2. It's in Speedy at the moment. It's there to be experimented with. So ways it's being used at the moment is Amazon on their Silk browser, on the Kindle Fire, do this thing where when you request a page on a Kindle Fire, it goes off to Amazon servers and they act as a proxy. But what they will also do is, because they know you've requested, say, BBC News, they'll know you need the fav icon for the BBC News, so they will push the fav icon to the BBC News out. So they'll discover all these relationships between web pages and start sending you critical content before your browser knows it needs it. And there are some classic targets of things we can do. We can use it for CSS. We can use it for fonts, providing we host the fonts ourselves. But what it enables us to do is short-circuit some of that latency penalty. Short-circuit some of the penalty of getting the HTML page, building the HTML page, building the render tree. So resources are in our browser before we need it. But there are lots of complicated techniques. There's lots of things that are going to change and we need to learn about, and our web servers need to become smarter about to take advantage of these. And we will only get the best out of it. We will only build the best user experiences if we deliver. If we actually design for performance in the beginning. If we don't consider performance as the last step of our development journey, but part of the first step of our development journey. And one of the key ways to do this is to think about performance budgets. To think about when you're building a site, when you're designing a site, what do you want the user experience to be? And that there are a number of ways you can get to that. So some people use their run data to establish what's the sweet spot. In the same way with the Walmart chart, where they showed the 1 to 2 seconds was their peak, where they got the best conversion, or below 2 seconds where they got the best conversions. We have to be practical. We can't deliver everybody a sub-step in performance. But if 2 to 3 seconds is a reasonable performance, then should that be what we aim for as a performance budget? And use a performance budget as a way of guiding the design process to deliver a performance site. And I think about performance budgets this way. Some people use page size or number of objects. I'll come on to those in a bit. But I like to specify performance budgets in this way. So an event that matters to the visitor happening within a set time under certain network conditions. So we saw back in part one how, with the Sainsbury's video, how network conditions play a huge part in affecting what the experience can be. An event, and that's an event that matters to your visitors. So maybe when your hero image appears, it may be when the buy now button appears. These are individual to different. These are different for different sites. But some examples of this are the BBC say BBC News should be usable within 10 seconds on GPRS connection. So we have whatever they define usable as. So we have an event in a time over a set of network conditions. Paul Irish of Google uses speed index, and what speed index is, it's a measure of perceived performance. It's how quickly a page, the viewport of a page reaches its final state. How quickly, each pixel goes from being white or blank to being the colour it is when that page is loaded. And what they do is you plot a chart and you map the area under the chart to see how quickly you got to get a measure. We could use page sizes or number of objects, but how does it work for this page? So this is the Guardian. And what the Guardian do is they have a swim lane approach to their page load. So they load their core content first, and that's the news story, will often with an image to go with it, so that even if only the first request succeeds, somebody has a usable page and they can read the news. And then they have a series of enhancements. And that might be adding touch handlers, it might be adding some more images, and then finally down the bottom they've got their leftovers, which includes their analytics and stuff like this. So in this situation is, if we use the number of objects or page size, none of them would represent the real user's experience because of the way they structured the page. So that's why I always go for an event within a time. If we're going to take performance seriously, then we have to measure. And we have to measure frequently. And not just once we put it live, but when we're building it too. And there's a whole heap of tools out there we can do that with. But one of the other things is not just about measuring it, but it's making it visible. And this is what Etsy do. Etsy are a craft marketplace. They're eBay for handmade items, the simplest way of describing them. They turn over about $1.4 billion a year. And everybody within Etsy has this toolbar over the top of their page when they browse their own site. And what it does is it shows people how quickly the page loads and whether it meets their SLAs. And we've tried to persuade them to open source this for a while and they never quite got around to it. So a guy in Saudi Arabia built a very similar thing. So by embedding perf bar in a web page, it will by default pull up these metrics, some of which may matter to you, some of which might not, but you can also set an SLA in there. So you can choose when it goes red. You can choose to include perf bar in only your site when you're looking at it internally. So if you have Etsy divide their users up to different classes, they have internal users, then they have early beta testers, and they can control who gets to see what version of the page on a fine-grained basis. So what you can do is if somebody's logged into your site and you can identify somebody from your company, you can automatically include some perf bar in it, so that in-house you get to see the real measurement of your page. The other way to build performance budgets is to build film strips and compare against your competitors. These are 5 UK supermarkets, and we can see that Morrison's and Sainsbury's and Tesco's do quite a good job, whereas Waitrose and Asda are a bit slower. So if I was Asda or Waitrose, I would not just be aiming for the Tesco's target, I'd be aiming to be faster than Tesco's target. But that's another way of setting a performance budget. The other way to make it visible is put it on big wallboards outside people's offices. So The Guardian actually have, not quite this because this is my side, but they actually have a screen like this that shows the performance of the Guardian website, the performance of New York Times and something else, sat outside their financial director's office and other people's offices in the building, so that they are always aware of what's going on. And performance matters so much to the Guardian that when they relaunch their US side, they actually press release the fact they were faster than all their competitors. So we've talked about latency, and we've talked about how the browser behaves. And when we're building sites, we need to remember those constraints, because they are the biggest things that impact what our visitors' experience will be. And we want our visitors to have a great experience. Ultimately, because if they have a great experience, we make more money. And that's fundamentally why we do it. And finally, I think everybody deserves a great web experience. But it only happens if we're deliberate about it, if we take the care, if we measure, and if we spend the time to deliver on it. And that's me. Thank you. The second half is shorter than the first. Finish full pizza cake. Are there any questions? Or have I just filled you all up too much? No. Well, if there are, come and grab me.
No questions at all now? Thank you very much for coming. Auto Trader, thank you for having us today. I'm Daniel Squires, I'm one of the account managers at NCC Group. There's a few NCC people here today. Stand up for a second just so you know who we are. So if you have got any questions, any of us, and include Andy into that, come and see us. Hopefully you can all join us for beer and pizzas, which is just in your room next door. It'd be great to see you all there. But in the meantime, Andy, thank you very much, and thank you very much all for coming.